Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to start this session with a small video that kind of inspired us into pursuing this topic. So watch closely, please. Pretty cool, hi. My name is Yinnon. I lead a team that does the Google chart tools. And together with me is Fink, the PM for that same team. And what we are going to talk about today is how to turn your data into a story. And to do that, we have the structure of this session will contain two parts. So in the first part, we'll take the data and we'll show you how to create a dashboard over this data that allows you to watch the data from different perspectives. Each perspective, each slice will show up a little bit different information. And the graph that you see below here is the different possibilities to go from one slice into another, and that dashboard, you will give this dashboard to your user, and that dashboard can be used to travel the data and slice and dice the data, moving freely in this graph. In the second part of the talk, we'll show you how to make a story out of that same data. And that story will resemble a path inside this graph that we've seen earlier. And without further delays, let's move and start with the first part. So the first part is all about how to create dashboards that allow you to explore your data, explore it freely. To explore data, I need to start with data. So the data that we chose today we wanted to start with the topic of the popularity of specific artists. And if you ask people how to measure the popularity of artists, of performers, you would get, like if you ask 5 persons, you would get around 7 different answers. So if you ask Michael Fink, who is also the product manager for Google Insights and Google Trends, he will tell you one answer, and that would be use the search popularity. Just consider how many times people have searched for Beyonce in this example, or how many times people have searched for Madonna. And that would give you some sort of a measurement of how popular Madonna and Beyonce. And you can do that for every single month or every single day. We chose the month granularity. And you can do it for every country in the world and for every performer, as we just discussed. And you would get a measurement that shows the popularity. The number doesn't mean anything. Just the comparison between those numbers mean everything you like. So you can see here that in the United States in December 2008, Beyonce was much more popular than Madonna, okay? And what we did is we extracted this data from 2004 until now for all the countries. Actually, I'm showing a little bit less than that, but for most of the countries. And for several performers, we extracted this information. And that's the information that we are going to be using today. So to be able to see parts of this data, we will need some sort of a way to slice and dice this data, or limit ourselves to viewing only parts of that data. So what we have here are controls. The first control will allow us to focus on a specific period of time. So now I'm watching the period of time starting at January 2009, and let's take it all the way to the end of 2009. And I can move this control, and the data table that you see over here, the table that you see over here, the data inside of that table changes. So I can control the time. And the same, in the same sense, I have controls that allow me to pick those countries that I want to watch. So currently, I'm watching the information only from the US and the UK, and I can add in any country that I like. I'm from Israel, so I'll add in Israel. And I can do that for the set of performers. So you can see here the set of performers that I picked for you, from Adele, Beyonce, Christina Aguilera, Jennifer Lopez, Justin Timberlake, and Madonna. So that will be the performance that we'll be looking at today. And I can move those controls, and the data table changes, and I'll see now it's Beyonce and Madonna, and I see the US, the UK, and Israel, as I requested. So it turns out that creating such a dashboard is quite easy using the Google Chart tools. How many of you are using the Google Chart tools? Have been using it? Quite a lot. How many of you were here last year in the talk that we gave? So most of you, it will be new. What we showed last year is how to create those dashboards. So I'm going to go pretty quickly on that. But if you want more details, you can look at the lecture. You can watch the lecture. It is recorded. So dashboards are quite easy. Most of our libraries, most of the library that we made, we try to make it as easy as we can. We try we try for the programmer to do the minimal coding required to set up. So the dashboard is no different. All you need to do is to create a dashboard, is to create this dashboard object that will be controlling your different controls and visualizations in the dashboard. So we are setting up this dashboard, and then we are setting each of the controls, the time picker control, the country picker control, and the performer picker control. And each of our visualizations, in this case, we have only a table visualization, so that's the table chart over here. In some sense, each of those, if you know the library, so you know what chart are, each of those wrappers wrap together the chart with a specific preset of configuration. So you end up, so the table chart is all about picking up a chart of a specific type, table, and stating up ahead what will be the options that you will be using and how do you want to view this data in the table. But the magic happens here. Here we give those controls and visualizations to the dashboard, and we give them, we chain them together in some information flow. So we take the output of the time picker control and we squeeze that into the country picker control. If you remember, the time is the first, then the country, and at the end we have the performer. So we take the output of the time picker control, squeeze that into the country picker, and the country picker into the performer picker. From the performer picker, we take the output and we put it into the table chart. And the reason that you see arrays over there is that you can take the data from one control and push it into many visualizations and vice versa, in some sense. So once you've done with that, all you need to do is draw your dashboard with the data that you want to push. Sorry about that. That's hush. Okay. So I try to make the code snippet from the previous slide easy to read, so I removed all the details, but there are details, and people would want to customize their controls. If you think about it, a time picker control, you might want to customize the initial range that he will be showing. So in this case, we are showing a range of from November 2008 to March 2009. That's the initial range that we are using. And you might want to customize the way, the minimal amount of time spent that the control will allow the user to physically grab. We have a whole bunch of configuration for each of the controls. It's the same as we do for the visualizations. We follow the different requests and create flexibility to handle those. So watching the data using a data table doesn't help us a lot. It kind of dumps the data on top of us. And what I want to do is I want to use visualizations to actually show the data. So if you look at the data that I'm currently showing in the table, it has several different times, several different countries, and several different performers. So it's kind of hard to show all of that in the same visualization. If I'm willing to reduce one of the dimensions, for example, the time dimension, I can show a bar chart, right? Once I focused on a specific date, December 2008, I'm left with 4 data points. The popularity of Beyonce and Madonna in the US and the UK. I was smart about that. Okay, and I'm able to show a bar chart that compares the two, and of course I can add in any other more information, and still the bar chart will be useful because I'm able to compare the different states, and I'm able to see, for example, that the gap between Beyonce and Madonna in the US is huge, but in India it's not like that. Okay, so it's quite useful to use a bar chart for this situation, but if I'm reducing myself to only to one country, for example, the US, I don't need a bar chart. I can still use a bar chart, but I don't need a bar chart. I can use much cleaner visualizations, such as a pie chart, a donut chart in this case. It's the same. So if I'm reducing another dimension, I can go and use a more simple visualization. If I reduce another dimension, let's reduce the performer dimension. Okay, so now I have 4 data points that I had to present. But if I'm reducing another dimension, what do you think I can do? How many lines would I have left in my table? probably 1, right? So showing one line is all about showing just a number. I can still move the dashboard around, okay, and I can still see that gauge changing from one value to another, but it's going to be one value at each time. So I feel a little bit that this space in my slide is not being used very efficiently. I can see a lot of time in the same visualization, right? I can now watch the period of that I just showed, and I can see the popularity of Beyonce in the United States throughout this period. I can even compare different artists in the same slide, right? There is no reason for me to just show Beyonce. I can compare them all together. And I can even compare states together, right? I can just put in Croatia and see how throughout this period that I picked, I can see how the popularity of Beyonce is different in those different states that I just picked. You know what? I want to try to view all the countries all together. And to do that, I'm going to remove this filter altogether. So I'm going to show all the countries in one visualization. That's going to be quite horrible, right? It's quite hard to watch. But if I were to reduce the time that I'm looking at into one month, a specific month that I will be watching, I can view all this information very clearly on a geographical chart, a geo chart. So that's how I can do that. Let's say I looked at this information and I figured that the difference between the different states, it doesn't matter for my story. It doesn't give me any insight. So let's just average around that. Let's just look at the world as a whole. Once I reduce this country dimension, I'm again free to explore my data. I'm free to take a look at more information. And essentially, I reduced one of the dimensions, so I'm left with visualizing the two other dimensions. I can do the same averaging for the date. And I can add more performers. And now I'm looking at the performance of those artists throughout the duration of 2008, because I'm averaging over the period of 2008. I think that being a good performer is about being consistent and being searched a lot throughout a big period of time. So I'm looking at the entire period of 2008. Okay. So what we are seeing here is that for each of the different domains that we have, the time, the country, and the performer, we have several possibilities. We can pick one value, or we can pick several values, or we can aggregate over those values. We choose to average around those values, but we could have used other aggregation methods when it suits. And we can do that independently for each of the domains. So we are left with this cube of possibilities, and it's an exponential number in the number of domain columns that we have. And this data that we have right here only contains one metric, right? The popularity metric. We could have had several of those metrics, and we could have used different visualization. And all this combination of possibilities is hard, because you are left with just throwing that kind of a dashboard onto your user. It's impossible to navigate. It's not impossible, but it's kind of letting him solve the problem on his own. And what you really want to do is you want to walk him through the story of those performers instead of just throwing the information at him. So for that, I give you Michael, who will be showing you how to walk the story, how to tell a story using that same data.
Thank you, Yinnon. Thank you, Yinnon. So I think the state that you're all currently in is what doctors call data vertigo. Okay, you've seen slices and dices of this data, and that was only 3 dimensions and 1 metric. It's probably the simplest data that one could explore. And Yinnon demonstrated very nicely, I think, that there's like an exponential number of possibilities in exploring that data cube. And for each of those individual slices that he showed, he only showed 1 visualization, but often there are several visualizations that you could show. So as Yinnon said, what we would like to have in certain cases, we would like to have a way to walk our users, not inflict all of the data cube on them, but rather walk them through a very carefully curated path of slices that tells a story. And that's what this part will be about, telling a story. Now, when we are trying to think how to tell a story, we could essentially address a challenge that people have been addressing for several thousands of years. And we thought it would be nice to go back to the classical 3-act play that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. I think this was suggested back in ancient Greece. And the 3-act play essentially says, if you want to tell a story, start with Act 1 that should essentially present the characters that are in this story, the protagonist, the antagonist, establish the time and space where this story is taking place. And the Act 1 usually ends with the conflict, with establishing the conflict. What is the grand challenge that the protagonist has to address throughout the story? Then Act 2, which is usually kind of the main bulk of the story, are the different attempts of the main character to try to address that conflict, address the grand challenge that he must overcome. Often the big conflict is derived into many smaller conflicts. And then in Act 3, you reach the climax, where if it's a comedy, a positive story, things have not gone so well to the protagonist until this point, but suddenly there's a positive twist, and we all feel that suspense, and suddenly we all could relax that things have a happy end. If it's a tragedy, it's usually the other way around. Things seem to improve in Act 2, and then in Act 3, when the climax comes in, something dramatic happens, something tragic happens, and things take a turn to the bad. Now, when you see this in Google I/O, you're probably wondering, why am I listening to the 3-act play in Google I/O? And what we try to do as a team is to address this challenge of taking these principles and trying to see how could these help us with our data-based storytelling. So we created a concrete story that we wanted to tell you about. And the name of this story is Reaching for the Stars. Now, this is data-driven storytelling. So the first thing I want to do in Act 1, here's the opening act, is establish space. Okay, where is this story happening? So what we're going to do in this story, we're going to try to show the success of different performers. And we wanted to think of what would be a good benchmark to say, this performer is definitely successful if he's able to pass this threshold. And this is the threshold that we found. And we chose this threshold very carefully. We were trying to think of a topic that humanity is interested in for thousands and thousands of years. And we thought, what would be a good term to plug into Google Trends and to see interest that has been around for a while? And we said, well, humanity has been interested in God for a while, right? So we said, okay, let's just type in God in Google Trends, and we get this line, and that's just how many people every month have essentially typed the word God into Google search. And we thought that would be a very interesting threshold because this is definitely a very well-established point of interest. And what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to try to show a few performers, and you'll see them in the context of this threshold. So let's take a look at Justin Timberlake. So even in the height of his success, Justin Timberlake is, he's getting close, but he's not quite there. What about Christina Aguilera? So Christina Aguilera, 4 Grammys, again, she has her ups, she has her downs, but she's never quite able to pass that very high threshold that we said a second ago. J-Lo, okay, so J-Lo sold over 55 million albums throughout her history, but still way below that threshold that we set a minute ago. So this is kind of establishing space. I think you understand where we're going. And now what I want to do is establish time and zoom back in time, back to 2004, and present our protagonist, the main hero of our story, Madonna. Now, I'm a big, big fan of Madonna all the way back from the time I was probably in the 2nd grade. So she's been around, for 20-something years. And the Guinness World of Records declared Madonna as the top-selling female recording artist of all time. But at 2004, she was already towards, the career was around for about 20 years, and a lot of people were thinking, this is, Madonna is not someone we'll be hearing about much in the future. But me and several other dedicated fans, we knew that something big is coming. And in 2004, indeed, Madonna was working on a big new album, and look what happened next. Confessions on a Dance Floor came out and did an amazing thing. It was able to pass in 1 month, to pass that amazing threshold that we set earlier on. So, all of our local fan club are obviously celebrating. And while Madonna reached this phenomenal success, other actors or other performers were out there and trying to replicate the success. And here's, I'm introducing the antagonist in the story. So we have here Beyonce, completely different generation of performer, and Beyonce split from her band, Destiny Child, and emerged as a superstar with her disc B-Day. And I really remember this as a tragic day when I saw Beyonce pass my beloved Madonna in Google search. And going on to receive 5 nominations, 5 Grammy nominations. And we're pretty much at the end of Act 1. We presented the different characters in our story. We presented time, we presented space, and obviously the conflict is there. And Madonna in the Rock Hall of Fame competing with the next generation of performers that are emerging. And now we're entering Act 2. So what happens at the beginning of Act 2? Madonna tries to recuperate. Releases Hard Candy, which was I have to admit, not one of her best records, but still gaining some momentum. And then Sticky and Sweet, which was really an amazing tour worldwide. That was an awesome tour. But Beyonce quickly recovers, releases 3 consecutive #1 hits in the United States, and the divorce of Madonna from Guy Ritchie definitely did not help in this point of time. And even her compilation disc that came out later did not help Madonna in recover from where she was later on. Beyonce goes and gains the MTV Video Music Award, and a few months later, she gets a world record of 6 Grammys in one evening. And I think that the peak was when in the recent VMA stage, Beyonce announced that she's pregnant and all of the world is rejoicing, and my beloved Madonna is way behind. A few months later, she gives birth. She calls her daughter Blue Ivy. And at that point, Beyonce is on the all-time record of popularity in Google search. Now, what people don't know is that the next month, Madonna is scheduled to appear in the Super Bowl. How many people here have seen Madonna in the Super Bowl this year? Cool, that's nice. How many people went online and searched for Madonna after the Super Bowl? You did? Really? Cool. So it's me and you. So will Madonna be able to pass Beyonce? Act 3, suspense, right? So let's see. Almost, right? He almost was able to pass Beyonce's declaration of having the Blue Ivy born, but she was not quite able to do it, and she was definitely not able to replicate her historical achievement of passing that very high threshold that we set earlier on. So this was a story told with the exact same data that Yinnon presented earlier on, right? It's the same data cube, but it's a very careful sequence of slices of data that are curated in a way that they get you engaged. You're interested in the story. You want to know what happens next. You relate to the characters, and you try to I think what will be the outcome of the story, an experience that you don't have while you're doing data exploration. And this is just one story from that data cube that Yinnon presented. There are thousands of different stories. Let's take, for example, another story that could have been derived from Yinnon's data. Adele, releasing 19, A few months later, appearing in Saturday Night Live, still not gaining the momentum that she was hoping for. But then she wins a Grammy for the Best New Artist and releases 21, which was her kind of a big hit. And Someone Like You becomes the #1 hit in the United States. And look what happens next. Okay, whoa. So there are endless number of stories that you could choose across that same data cube that Yinnon presented earlier on. So what we did in the last year, we tried to think what would be the best tools that we, as the Google Chart tools, could provide you as developers in order to tell these types of stories. And we came up with a few tools that essentially were displayed here, and I'd like to show you through a few code snippets that will help you understand how we built this presentation. So the first thing I want to show is you see here a small summary of what we saw in the previous slide. You see Adele's amazing achievement in green, and you see that we have this effect of graying out both Madonna and Beyonce, saying at this point of time, these two data series are out of scope. They have that gray shade of indicating that they're out of scope. Okay? Another thing that we did here is we used the visual semantics of saying maybe occasionally at certain time points you want to have an informative tooltip that says in this data time something interesting happened. How do we add this? So take the same data table that Yinnon talked about earlier on, and imagine that the first column is time, as it was in previously, and the second column could include data on Madonna. But then we add to the data on Madonna, we add another column of data, which is binary data, and just says, is the previous series, is it in scope or out of scope? Should it be grayed out or not? So let me kind of emphasize the part here. So we introduce a new column into the data table that has a specific term that we call a role, and we give it a role of indicating whether it's in scope or out of scope. And if we want the entire line to be gray, we just give it a function that just always returns false, and that will just mean that it's continuously out of scope, but you could define certain ranges that would be out of scope. So that's one visual semantic that was applied here to Madonna and to Beyonce. A second visual semantic that we introduced is this notion of tooltips or rich tooltips. This is not launched yet, but it will be launched very soon. And there, again, you just add another column of data into your data table, and you put HTML snippets in that column, and we will be presenting that as the tooltip once someone hovers over that individual data point. A second set of tools that is very important for storytelling is animations and smooth transitions that help the user maintain context. So we introduced two types of animations. One of them I'd like to present now, which is what we call the view window animation. And this is super simple. Essentially, it lets you draw all of your data on a big canvas across all of the time that is needed. And then you could define smaller view windows that show the chart across different time periods. So just as a concrete example, you could see here that we have a view window defined from 2004 to 2012. And then what we could do is we could, once this is rendered, if we want to have a zoom in effect, we could define a function that will run, and it will define a new view window that goes from the beginning of 2005 to the end of 2005. So we went from the long range to the much smaller range. And the only things that you have to provide is the animation duration. Okay, so you only provide 2000 as a 2-second animation, and we take care of all of the rest. Okay, so that's kind of the building blocks that you will be using. If you want to add a listener that says once this zoom animation finishes, I want you to do another effect. In this example, pan to 2006. The only thing that you have to do is define another function that goes to 2006, and we'll take care of that panning effect and just give us, the duration that you want us to do, and we will take care of that. So that was the roles and animations, and so far we heard, stories of superstars trying to reach for the stars. But when we were preparing for Google I/O this year, we were thinking about, what will be another great example of a story. And I remember Yinnon and I were brainstorming for probably 2 or 3 hours. And we were saying maybe the disaster in Fukushima will be interesting, or maybe the Arab Spring, if we want to be a bit more optimistic. Maybe we'll take financial data, and we'll give you a story on financial data. But then we thought all of these stories are, everything has been done already, right? We want to have something new, something fresh. And what we decided to do is to give you the tools to tell your own story. okay? And that's what we're going to do in the last part of this talk. How will we be doing this? I want you all, how many people have laptops? You all should have laptops, so open your laptops. And I want you to type in that GoogGL, that's XW9 capital C3. Wait a second, so your laptops could come up. And we're definitely going to crash Google Spreadsheets servers in this experiment, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Okay, so once you typed in goog.gl/xw9 capital C3, you'll be seeing a spreadsheet, a bit like the spreadsheet you have here in the bottom. And the first thing I want you to do is to make your own copy of that spreadsheet, okay? Because that's my personal data, and I don't want you to look into my personal data. So make a copy of that spreadsheet, go to File, make a copy. Once you make a copy, you'll notice on the bottom of the spreadsheet there are two sheets. One is called Controls, and the other one is called Emails From. So just make sure that you return to the Emails From sheet, okay? So I'll give you just one more second to do that. Perfect. So you should be seeing this, a spreadsheet that looks a bit like this with your copy. And then it has two columns, two interesting columns, column B and column C. And in cell B1 and in cell C1, the following thing happens. I wrote there from me to Dan and from me, David, in C1. And I just want you to replace those two names, Dan and David, with two people that you know. Okay, so one of them could be, say, an old-time friend that you've been in a relationship for a while with, and the other one maybe could be someone that you've met in the last few months. And what I've done is I wrote a short app script that takes this, what you wrote in cell B1 and in cell B2, and what it will do, it will go to your Gmail account. Don't worry, this is completely private. It's your own spreadsheet, and it will go to your own Gmail account if you give it permissions, but you know, keep that in mind and share with caution. It will go to your Gmail account and just populate a spreadsheet that has month by month how many times emails from you had the word Dan or David or whatever names that you introduced. Once you've done that, you could click on the tools, and within tools there's the script editor. And within script editor, you'll have a run button. So click the run button over there. It will ask you for a sequence of permissions. Say yes, yes, yes if you're interested. Feel free to say no if you're not interested. And once you've finished giving all of those permissions, you'll have to run it again. Okay, so run it again. I'm optimistic, and I'm thinking that maybe at least one of you was able to follow that sequence of instructions. But this is a cute toy, and you'll be able to play with it later on. And once you run that and wait for, say, 10 or 15 seconds, the app script will go to your Gmail account, fetch all of the counts of how many times that name was mentioned, and will populate that spreadsheet. Okay, so that's essentially the toy I wanted to share with you. And the reason I wanted to share this toy with you is because I thought it would be a good opportunity for you to go later on home and say, how could I take this data and tell my story? And I'd like to motivate you by showing the story that I built on my personal story using this data. Okay, so I'll ask you now to resist the temptation to keep on playing with this tool until the end of the talk and listen to the story that I have to tell. Okay, so I don't know if you recognize the main actor in this story. Our UI designers did an amazing job in replicating my glasses. So what I did, instead of writing a name, like you wrote Dan or David, I used the exact same tool that I gave you just a second ago, and I just wrote the word great. Okay, how many times do I have threads that I've sent out that have the word great? And you could see that I do not use the word great lightly throughout history. Actually, certain months I did not use the word great at all. But then in the last 3 months, this amazing spike, okay? Listen to this. In March 2012, just 3 months ago, I used the word great 34 times. That's like I write great every day now, okay? And the question that you're probably asking yourselves is what happened that made this dramatic shift for me to start writing great? And this is the story that I would like to share with you. So before we start with our story, a few other experiments that I did. I wrote different words like design, YouTube, machine learning, brain and cognition, different topics that interest me, visualization and travel, and then I aggregated over time, like Yinnon showed earlier on. I did that type of averaging, and then I could have this nice donut. So you could see that, for example, traveling, I have 58 mentions of traveling. And what you could see here in the left-hand side is you could see, with using the exact same tool that I showed you a few minutes ago, you could see different cities or countries in the world that were mentioned in my email across the last years, and you could see that I've traveled quite a lot. And essentially, I think that we started by, showing or describing the protagonist of this story. And now let's turn to the antagonist. And often, an antagonist is just another character in the story, the bad guy. But there are many stories where the antagonist is not necessarily another person. It could be like a force of nature. You're fighting against a storm or something else. It could be a psychological force or a psychological flaw that the actor must overcome. And here I'll be sharing with you some of my personal flaws, so please keep it in this room, and let's ignore the fact that everything is taped and sent throughout the world. But I want to give you a perspective of the different women that I've had significant relationships with in the last few years. And here you could see my problem surfacing is that I'm not able to find the right woman. Okay, so some of these relationships are very short, okay? Some of them are much longer. Some of them are, have a lot of communications in them, like the one here in green. Some of them, are shallower. And this will be kind of a theme that I'll try to develop while telling my story. So we talked a bit about the main actor. We talked a bit about the conflict that he has to address. And now we want to establish time. Okay, so we'll be moving back to the end of 2006. And at that period of time, I moved from working in Google Mountain View to working back in Israel. And this was towards the end of my first marriage. And I remember coming back to Israel and drinking a beer with my good friend Johnny. And I was kind of lamenting, Johnny, why don't my relationships work? What could be done? And he told me, Michael, it's a question of expectations. He told me the following thing. He said, in your league, a girl could be sane, she could be pretty, she could be interesting, she could be fun. There are a lot of positive things that could be around a girl. But in your league, you'll never get more than 2 out of these 4. Okay, that was his expectation. And he said, if you set that expectations, things will gradually improve. So I was, John is known for his infinite wisdom, and I was thinking about, my current relationship or my ending relationship with my first wife, and I said, yeah, she was definitely sane, she was definitely pretty, but things were not interesting. That was, I understood that there are, she had 2 of these characteristics, but she definitely did not have 4 out of 4. So I remember I was back in the university at that time, and suddenly I met May. And she was something completely different, right? She was pretty, but she was super interesting. She was really, really interesting. And you could see the surge in emails that I've started sending to May. And if on the top here, these are emails that I've been sending. What I'd like to show you now is the number of emails that I've been receiving, okay? So on the top is emails I've been sending. On the bottom, emails I've been receiving. And you can see that, my relationship with Diane, where it was kind of, I would send an email, maybe get an email back, maybe not. But with May, I would send an email, and suddenly I would get like 10 emails back. And I was like, at the beginning, I was super excited that, that all of this interest and all of this attention. But what started as a lot of attention became way, way, way too much, very, very soon. And that relationship didn't last for long. So I found myself back in the dating scene. And using the same tool that you guys will play around later on, I just wrote the word dating, okay? And I got an aggregation of how many threads had the word dating. And you could see that in that fairly sad period of time, I had points where I had 51 threads in a certain month that had the word dating in them. And then I would try to recover from that. And then probably my all-time high, 79 threads, active threads with the word dating in September 2007. And I was like, this is way too much. I can't deal with this anymore. And I remember one evening I went on a date. I was sure it will be, yet another date. And then something truly amazing happened. okay? I went to this date, and I met Tammy. And I start talking to her, and I was like, whoa, she's sane, she's pretty, she's interesting, she's fun. And I called Johnny. I'm like, 4 out of 4, 4 out of 4, Johnny. It's amazing, it's happening. And I was like all excited by this. But unfortunately, the curse of the 2 traits was probably correct, because she called me like 2 or 3 days later, and she said, it's not you, it's me, and she took off. So I was heartbroken by this, and I decided to leave Jerusalem, which is pretty much like Wyoming in Israel, and move to the big town, to Tel Aviv, which is like New York or San Francisco. So I moved to Tel Aviv, and truly like a day after I moved to Tel Aviv, I met my second wife, Lily. And what was amazing is that we met online. But although we met online, it turned out, I asked her, where do you live? And it turned out she lives like 3 doors away from where I live in Tel Aviv. So that was truly amazing. So you could see here the place where she lives. Here's where I live. This was like our first date. Here we got married. We moved into that apartment. So everything was like in a radius of maybe 100 meters from and I saw this as a sign. I said, this is a sign. This is a relationship that will definitely work. And I had this resolution: I will make this relationship a success no matter what. That was my resolution at the time. And we started. Everything looked good, but like in a matter of 2 months, like the first crisis kicked in, and we broke up for 2 or 3 weeks. Then we got back again, and you could see this roller coaster effect of this relationship. And probably the saddest point in the story is when I said, you know what, maybe the problem is that we're not living together. Big mistake, guys, okay? Don't. So I said, let's move in together. Here, come move into my apartment. She moved into my apartment on September of 2008. And what you could see here is that, August, July, August, I've been using the word love 3 or 4 times a month. I've been using the word fun. And now she moves in, like love barely once a month, fun completely out. Okay, so definitely not a good move there. But you remember my resolution: this will succeed no matter what. So a few months later, we had yet another crisis. I went down to Sinai to think about what should I do. She flew over to Greece to think what she should do. And like in the 3rd day of thinking, I said, Michael, remember your resolution. You have to make this work. I literally took the first flight to Greece, found the island where she was hiding, found the hut, knocked on the door, and I told her, Lily, I want you to marry me. I think we could make this work. So I was somewhat over-optimistic at the time. We decided to move. We said, oh, maybe the problem was that she moved into my apartment. Let's move into a joint apartment. Okay, so we moved into a joint apartment. Some disastrous things happened, and eventually, at a certain point, we broke. And you could see that after breaking up, I was devastated. I failed with my resolution to make this relationship succeed, and my mentions of great go and decline. I'll keep the story short because we have to finish in a few minutes, but after I was devastated, I met Anna, who was my girlfriend until just recently. And again, we had sane, we had fun, a new combination this time, sane and fun. And I always remember Johnny in the back of my mind saying, you have to settle down for 2 out of 4. You have to settle down for 2 out of 4. Just accept it, and everything will turn out okay. And then a few months ago in September, I suddenly get an email. I get an email from Tammy, 4 out of 4. You remember that the dream that I thought that could happen once. And once I got the end, she sent me like this benign email, like, how are you doing, or something like that. And I thought, maybe she's interested, maybe she, maybe. And ever since I got that email, I noticed that the correspondence with Anna, my current girlfriend, kind of went downhill. And I said, I have to go and think about this. So I flew over to India. I don't know if you could see this, but I flew over to India. And I said, Michael, you have to make a decision. Could you just accept it that 2 out of 2 is what you could, is what you should settle for, or should you follow your dream and try to find that magical 4 out of 4 women? So I was thinking, and I was in India like for a month, and let me ask you guys, should I follow my dream or should I settle for 2 out of 2? Follow your dream, right? Good choice. So I came back and I told her, listen, I have to follow my dream. I'm sorry, it's not you, it's me. And I got the guts to call up Tammy. You remember, 4 out of 4. I got the guts to call her. And to my surprise, she's like, yeah, sure, we should go out. Great. And 2 months later, we moved in together. And it's like, whoa, this is great. Everything's working out. And that's pretty much the end of the story. And that's why everything seems great now. I think that with that, we will end. But just one more second. I want to have a serious summary slide so you don't think that this talk was all about fun. So we presented 2 models. One was focused on data exploration. The other one was focused on storytelling. Data exploration, as Yinnon explained at the beginning of this talk, is essentially looking at the exponential number of slices of data and saying that all of the legitimate moves that your controls provide is like one big graph that the user could navigate through. Storytelling, on the other hand, is you making a very careful decision on what slices of data do you want to show him and in what sequence and in what tempo do you want to show them in order to emphasize a certain point. So one has exponential components, the other one has linear components. One provides an unbiased point of view. Here's a dashboard, go explore the data. The other one has a certain agenda that you could use to promote. One has the user required to engage with the controls and know what he's doing. And the other one, the user has the advantage and disadvantage of being passive. The response to dashboards are your users are often overwhelmed, while story could gauge interest and walk the user through the data that you might be interested in. And one last thought that I want to share before concluding is that these 2 models are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, so what you could do, and one of the big advantages that Google Chart Tools provides both of these models in one unified framework, is that you could say, let me start by exposing the data via story, get the user engaged, instead of just giving him a dashboard, interface. Let me show him through a story, but then at any given time, or maybe at the end of the story, say, let the user get the power to say, oh, do you remember that scene? I wonder what happened a bit before or a bit after. And suddenly you could build an interface that easily transitions between these 2 frameworks, between storytelling and between data exploration. Thank you. So, technical questions for Yinnon or other questions to me? Thanks. We're here for the next 20 minutes if you want to grab us. Thank you.